studied Emerson in your career for a long time, and
Yep.
you predominantly focus on Emerson, and I know rhetoric as well.
Yes, I mean, in terms of the Emerson studies, it's kind of the intersection of rhetorical history and Emerson's place in it is kind of what I deal with.
So what, first off, what drew you to Emerson initially? And then maybe to follow up, why do you think that he's significant today?
Okay. I mean, these are good questions. Emerson folks tend to, like when Emersonians gather, and we do sometimes, we oftentimes talk about this kind of come to Emerson moment, right, as opposed to come to Jesus moment, right, where many of us have been kind of involved in a line of study, and then we read some Emerson and we're like, this is it, this is the one that is bringing things together for me. And that I had that experience. I was working on my master's degree. I'd completed my coursework. Almost all my coursework was in British literature at the time. And I had spent very few classes in American class, and I was in a class in which Emerson's essays were taught, and I read Self-Reliance and Circles and another one I can't think of the time, probably Experience. And I remember just thinking, not only did I like the way he was expressing himself, but I felt really challenged by it, and it felt like he was kind of bringing together threads of thought that I hadn't been able to put my finger on exactly before. And I just like, I've got to know and understand what's going on here. So I immediately grabbed more of his work and started reading, and actually ended up writing my thesis on him, despite almost all my coursework being in British Lit. Wow. I just got so engaged with him and his work, I just couldn't stop reading it. And, you know, it's interesting, some years later, you know, I had been doing other types of work around different issues, and I decided I really wanted to finally get this book together on Emerson and the history of rhetoric. And so I started reading Emerson again, kind of in the primary, because I'd done some work up in the archives and read some from his journals and letters and such. But I hadn't reread some of the essays in a number of years, and when I did, I just fell in love all over again. So I guess either I didn't progress, or he's speaking to me across different time frames, so, or maybe a little bit of both. But I really, you know, he speaks to me, certainly, and I think he speaks a lot to the kind of the American condition. I still think what he has to say is relevant, especially now. I think how he thinks about how he advances a notion of the self as at once empowered but also obligated, right? It would be a really important message in today's world, right, where these kind of tensions around individual rights versus communal obligations, right? In the pandemic era, I think actually Emerson provides us a way to negotiate that stuff, right? Where we can empower and and guide ourselves while not losing track of our obligations to our citizenry.
Right. You know, from what I've read, that's the beauty that I see, is his ability to, you know, lift the individual up while simultaneously connecting, you know, yep. Like you use the word obligations. Yep. And I know, like in your book, which I have right here.
Appreciate the plug.
Yeah, there'll be a few probably. So, you know, in your book, you mentioned this idea of like a Platonic or a Platonian truth, and him trying to fuse that with like civic duty in a democracy.
Yeah.
You know, and it's interesting. I you know, just for some context here, I took Professor Thompson's class in American literature, and I remember you mentioning how self-reliance, and with me reading it, it can come off, especially initially, as this sort of almost libertarian, like right. individual sort of mantra in a way. As it goes on, you see that that's not really the case. But how does he fuse this like individualism with this sort of civic duty and this sort of greater harmony?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it requires you know, self-reliance is frequently and often and not totally inaccurately read as kind of this kind of will to power type document, right?
Yeah.
And in the most crass sense of that, also not in terms of a kind of sophisticated look at what that might mean, but in terms of, hey, it's my life. There's a section in there where where he talks about, oh mother, oh father, I hope you respect my opinion, but I've got to go my own path, and if I have to essentially disown you, so be it. I hope that's not the case. I think there's value in our connection, but I've got to do it my own way, right? And this is this kind of notion of the self as all is it's a nice convenient American perspective, I think, in some ways, right? I mean, it's kind of Benjamin Franklin on steroids, with a philosophical rendering behind it, a justification for it. But the key part for self-reliance that we can't forget is that there is the thing that drives the self in Emerson's formulation is its connection to something greater than itself, right? Right? It's not that the self contains all; it's that the self is connected to all, right? And this is a fundamental difference that's really, really important, and it's kind of the core of Transcendentalism. I mean, the goal here is transcendence, right? And transcendence doesn't mean repudiating everything of the world or of your neighbors, but instead seeing how it's connected in such a way that your position is important, but only in the sense of it's part of an important constellation of other selves working in the world, right? And so without that sense of obligation to those others, you get really pretty profound misreadings. I mean, Emersonians were distressed to see, usually when there's a new president, there's some magazine or journal or online outlet will say, what does the president read, or what's the president's readings,
right.
or and of course Trump, self-reliance and Emerson is put out there, and I don't believe for
really?
a second.
Was it?
Yeah, it was
wow, I
agree on his list, but I also don't believe for a minute that Trump had anything to do with that list.
Right.
Maybe he was told about what, who knows, right? How the genesis.
This might work well for you if you
right, exactly. Right. Yeah. But who knows? Maybe he's a Emerson aficionado.
Loves Emerson.
Yeah.
Who knows? It is interesting because, I mean, like I said, as you read Self-Reliance, you see. Okay, and if you read other works by Emerson, you kind of already understand the context, like this transcendentalism, this connecting to something greater, this sort of, you are a vessel. I mean, I'm not versed in him, but the way that I read it is, you're sort of, if you act in accordance with your true self, your true nature, you are inherently a vessel then for God or for the divine, something like that.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. I'm a little nervous on the vessel language, not because it's inaccurate, but because it carries baggage with it that is problematic. I mean, it suggests a kind of passive pouring in, an Augustinian type of channeling or something like that, which is
right.
There's some truth to, right? But it's not the wholeness of it, because Emerson acknowledges this kind of process and becoming, right, of a person, right? That it's not just that one is actualizing oneself in the face of divinity, right? In other words, that there's solely this true self that you're trying to unravel in the face of a deity in some sort of way, but instead that this self may mutate and change, but only in such ways that further amplifies whatever that kind of greater, I want to use the word design, but that comes with baggage too, but this greater kind of purpose, sense of being in the universe might bring to you, right? And so how it happens in the world may look varied, right? So this is why he leads to things like, foolish consistencies, hobgoblin in little minds, or, his concern that, in a famous passage, right, that you might be misunderstood if you speak in hard words today what you thought, and then the next day speak in different hard words even though they contradict each other. And Emerson's response is, so you'll be misunderstood. It's so bad to be misunderstood. Jesus, Plato.
It's a very interesting paragraph, because of now the complications with technology. Everything is basically saved, right? Like everything that we say,
Yes.
everything that we put out, even from a very young age, is sort of there's a paper trail, and for lack of a better word, So it's a very profound statement.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about it in terms of, well, I mean, I've thought about it in terms of print and the way that print holds meaning over a period of time. But in technological age, where every aspect of our utterances, even verbal, can be documented and held, how do we find a statement of meaning and purpose for that if we shift constantly? I mean, I know some of the things I'm sure I would have advanced 20 years ago, I'm pretty sure I would pretty clearly rebuke now.
Right.
Even if I don't want to rebuke it as part of my development to where I am now, I want to rebuke it as something I wouldn't want to advance now, but I also see it as part of my pathway, right? The journey of
right. And that's the beautiful part. That's the curiosity. That's the figuring things out. It allows this growth. I think it allows this movement.
Absolutely. And I mean, for Emerson, it's part of the necessity of a kind of democratic idealism also, right? Without that ability and willingness and embrace, right, of the idea that what we might believe at one point can change, right? And that it can change in very dramatic ways, that we can't actually reach some consensus as to how life should be, how we should act in the world. I mean, what do we do if we have to maintain a centrality of what's the right way of saying it? A kind of centrality of just a single perspective that dominates everything we do, right? And that doesn't mean that's inherently bad either. I mean, he's not condemning that. He's simply saying, don't judge the person who decides that doesn't work anymore, right? that you don't have to cling to the same thing over and over again simply to remain consistent in your thoughts on one topic to another. I mean, I know for myself, I'm conflicted on all sorts of moral questions, because I know that in one domain, I believe one thing fairly solidly. In this other domain, that doesn't seem to reconcile. So what do I do, right? So I have this conflict, and for me, what's beautiful about Emerson is that it's like, okay, dwell, right? Like, live in that spot and articulate it. And if you don't like what it sounds like, try it again. And this is the joy of teaching also, of course, right? I mean,
exactly.
Part of the misunderstandings of universities in particular, I think, is that people don't understand how much it's a trying on space for ideas. It's students do say crazy things, just like faculty say crazy things sometimes in classrooms, and we talk about it, and then we decide whether that's what we want to actually believe or not. We got to have the room to
get to map out reality in a way, right? Like to understand what you're seeing or what path to take potentially,
and what you can do there, and I think what Emerson would appreciate in some ways is that it demarcates boundaries sometimes, right? It kind of says, oh, no, this quadrant of the map, I thought we were here, but no, we're actually in over here, right? And we can't really, this is the no man's land that we don't want to go into, right? This is where the demons and monsters lie, right? But sometimes we don't know that till we actually put our foot into it and realize we've been bitten, right? If we're so proud that we can't say, oh no, I'm getting bitten here, right? Then we're in real trouble, right?
Yeah, then the head's coming off, no, that's right. Not the foot.
That's right, exactly.
So, I just want to go back to self-reliance, because I was looking at it the other day, and, it's, the beginning is almost troublesome to me, in the sense that he says something like, he's talking about nature and to like follow your nature. And there's almost this, he's treading very close to sort of like one can only act in one's nature, that like one doesn't even really have a choice, that even if they have ideas or beliefs, they're just sort of a little markings, but the greater scheme is like in the same direction, something like this. But then he says something like, if I am of the devil, or if I am the devil's child, let me be of the devil, or something like that. And it really it's funny. I mean, obviously the devil is a point here, but also the sentiment there reminds me of this Miltonian Lucifer, right? Like this idea of inverting certain things because it is my nature. Like,
Yeah.
it's almost as, and I could be reading this totally wrong. It's almost as if he's saying like a my truth versus your truth type thing, like a sophism type. Man, what is it? Man is the measure of all things type sentiment. But then again, he draws on Plato all the time, and this sort of absoluteness and transcendentalism that we're transcending to, and that there's this oneness. Can you sort of parse that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's one of the problems with Emerson, right? How do you negotiate this terrain? And so I think I'd approach that from a couple different angles. And I should say, part of my classes is sometimes we talk about this very issue, like what do you do with the fact that Emerson says, I'm going to speak this in hard ways today, and then and the context of that passage is, he's talking to one of the divines, one of the clergy, and the clergy member says, yeah, but what if that thing that you're uttering from deep inside and that you believe is so true is of the devil? And he says, so be it, then I'm of the devil, right? And yeah, what's that mean exactly? How would he do that? And it's key to point out that he says there, I don't think it to be the case, right? But if it is the case, right?
Right.
And certainly Emerson's not going to be enamored of some idea of some external devil hell that we have to worry about influencing and pricking at our brains. But the point is still clear that, look, if this sense of what I think is right is not virtuous or is evil, right, I've still got to speak it, right, because it's coming from me. So is that an internal kind of justification for speaking one's truth over and against righteousness or goodness or whatever that is? And the key part to that, and it's I grant that this is a bit of a get out of jail free card, is that for Emerson the speaking of that truth is ultimately part of a larger web of things, right? And so that whether or not one sees it as of the devil or not is grounded in kind of cultural reception of the idea, not in terms of the idea's relationship to some larger scheme of the universe or of being, right? And that person is just one little part of that, right? I'd also, and I'd also say, this is also early thinking for him relatively, right? So
I was going to ask you that, actually.
Yeah, it's earlier in his career, and you'll see later on, because he gets a lot of criticism for not confronting evil head on from other people's perspective. And a good example of this might be when his son died. There's a line in Experience that he writes, and it says famously, "This death of my son does not touch me. It does not touch me."
Wow. And
what he's referring to there is not that it doesn't cause him grief and pain. What he's suggesting there is that there's some core sense of some core being, and I want to be clear here. The being here is not is that part of himself that is connected to humanity as a whole, right? And so if you see that whole set of connections, then that death is so minuscule in comparison to the wholeness of the experience of humanity, right?
I totally get it. And let's just go here because I feel like it's in the back of my mind.
Yeah, sure.
I've brought up to you multiple times this sort of, the obviousness of the parallels between Emerson and sort of Eastern mysticism or Eastern philosophy. And that, like, today in America, we have a lot of that in our culture. I mean, like, our culture has drawn so much in the last decade on these sorts of ideas and these sorts of sentiments around what reality is, and connecting to the oneness, and connecting, almost stepping back from a individual perspective, or like perceiving things, like he is saying the death of his son, right? He's like looking at it from this macro lens, right? This oversoul type thing. So I mean, I don't know. I guess don't really, I mean, I have so many questions revolving around that. Do you think that he has, like, how has he influenced American society? And do you think that his ideas around these topics, did they seep into American culture during that time? Obviously, there was the Transcendental movement, which I know many people are familiar with it. I don't think many people are familiar that those ideas parallel what we're experiencing sort of right now.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. There's been this popularization of kind of Eastern mysticism in particular, and even a valorization of it in certain ways, right? I mean, I would date it even back New Age, kind of burgeoning of New Age, late 70s and 80s, right? Whatever that, but then it's kind of become leveled in a certain way. And can you draw a direct lineage? I'm probably not the best person to ask. Certainly, you can't avoid the resonances, right? Into the chiming of the crystals, maybe, right? Of where the things kind of connect, because there is a core idea, and it is important that the Transcendentalists were some of the first to, if not the first, to translate some of these Eastern mystic texts, right? And so, in the 19th century, certainly there was a strong push for trying to understand not only oneself in context of a larger culture, right, but one's spirituality in light of other spiritual movements around the globe, right? So the puritanical kind of hold over the American mind is giving way, not so much to deism as in the early 19th century, but to kind of broader notions, right? This is why you see all sorts of places like Brook Farm pop up, right, where people are trying these experiments in communal living to try to understand their relationship to each other and to some sort of larger spiritual purpose, right? I don't know enough about the current kind of movements along these lines to know how much some of those folks have read Emerson and in their own kind of tomes or things.
I don't think it's that they're reading Emerson. I think that
they probably need to, though, huh? Right?
They should.
Probably help them. No, I think probably some are. I don't know. I mean, it's strange. It's strange how many people love Emerson, like going behind the scenes. And I will say, I do think one of the popularization of these ideas comes through Thoreau, right? Emersonian idealism. Thoreau has his own stuff going on, certainly, right? But Emersonian idealism comes up in Thoreau, and I think Thoreau's popularization post Earth Day in 1970, and growing considerably since then to this day, that he's kind of a saint-like figure for so much of American culture. I mean, that it's hard to see that outside of Emersonian's ideas. It's just, at least for me.
Yeah, I mean, what I sort of meant, I guess, was that I'm sure people have read maybe Self-Reliance or Nature. I mean, Nature, I feel like, is a very popular one as well.
Yep.
I just don't think that is what maybe is driving them into these sorts of ideas necessarily. It's supplementary, maybe.
Yeah, that's fair.
Like,
or a pleasant discovery, right? Like, that's just like, way back then they talked about this stuff too, right?
But I feel like people are like, I don't know. I am so fascinated by the idea that this stuff, that these conversations are deeply rooted in American history. And you said to me that, at the time of Emerson, there was this big push to sort of separate American literature from British literature, and that they were trying very hard to articulate a new original American voice.
Right, yeah.
And I just, I guess my mind goes into the direction of how much of their effort sort of trick in some way or another, maybe in ways that we can't even perceive, have influenced this movement by setting up the conditions for it in a way, or contributing to the conditions of it. It's very interesting to me because I do see the sort of underlying philosophies of a lot of my peers today, and they are transcendental. Like, they are, it's the same thing, and it's so cool to me because it's, we are not hyper aware of the connection to this movement in the 1800s, you know? So I want to actually just get into some other questions.
Sure.
Let's see. Okay, so I had brought this question up to you. I'm going to drop this question.
That's great.
So in your book, you said that, you know, Emerson believed that the lecture hall would become the true church of his day. And what do you think that the true church of our day is? Or, you know, if you want to, you know, play Emerson, what do you think he would say as well?
Oh, no, that's great. So I think best way to answer that is in the context of what he's referring to with the lecture hall, right, which is kind of crucial, is this kind of as a space where all sorts of new forms of expression and ideas were being allowed, right? And he's contrasting it explicitly with the pulpit, right, which is in his mind kind of reified, formulaic, and formal. And as such is simply a replication of the same ideas, sometimes with new clothing, but basically the same thing over and over again. Whereas a lecture hall was allowing all sorts of new concepts to be introduced. And it was wildly popular. For people who don't know, in the 19th century, that was the form of entertainment. You know, there was, and not just entertainment, but edification, right? So you have the building of the lyceums across most of the states, across the country, as people, as small towns will build small lecture halls to invite speakers in on all sorts of topics. And as those lecture halls became increasingly widespread and increasingly, what's the word I'm looking for? As they become in all these towns across America, they too, though, start developing rigid boundaries as to what's allowed, such that by the 1850s, or 1840s even, it's kind of an unspoken rule, late 1840s, that you really don't talk about faith and religion that much, right? That it's around practical knowledge. It's also very American, right? The science, the burgeoning sciences, or how to arrange your money best, or take risks like that. Now, this bothered Emerson tremendously. He saw it as the same sin as the church had created, right, which was to become too codified, right, and too rule bound, and so new types of expressions and new ideas would be hobbled, right. And so it is really interesting to think about what that is today, right? Because certainly the expansion of social media, digital means of communication, the way that traditional media like television is being supplanted by online venues, even something like this, right, where serious conversations can be happening. I mean, this is in some ways the web, and I haven't given this any thought, though there's I know there's been some scholarship. I read an article some years ago about the way that Emerson's thinking replicates kind of the thinking around fractals, right, which is super interesting. Kind of this, the more you peer in, the more it looks like the things around it, but the individual pieces still look completely different, and except in the context of when you zoom in, it continues to look like itself, right? And so there's ways in which the internet, I think, would have been really exciting to someone like Emerson. Right? And partly because, not just because it allows all these ideas to congregate in one cyber, virtual space, but because more people are allowed to contribute, right? And because it democratizes things, right? That anyone can, and set aside the issues around, algorithms and profits and such like that, right? But let's take the early burgeoning of the internet, where such limits are not in place, right? Is it a church of today? Well, if we see the church as a place that reinforces ideas while also pushing forward new ones, that aligns groups of people under different banners in such a way that they can share ideas while also being exposed to new ones. I mean, that's pretty church-like.
Right. Yeah. It's funny because, Emerson to me comes off as maybe this is heavy-handed, but anti-traditional, or like anti.
No, absolutely. That's where I got him in trouble.
Okay, so good.
Yeah,
I'm
no,
not slandering.
not heavy-handed at all. I mean, as he gets older, he certainly becomes, the sage of Concord, who
Okay.
you might argue becomes pretty conservative, but certainly his radical thinking early on is anything but. I mean, he irritated lots of people.
Yeah, and it's it's really interesting to read, some of the things he's saying. Like, I can imagine how they were met with severe criticism. It's funny because, so he's anti-tradition, anti maybe institution or dead old institution.
Yes.
Um, he says these things like, we shouldn't be reciting the words of great people from history. Like, if we embody these ideas, or if we access them through our own,
Yep.
I'm paraphrasing, it could be
No,
wrong,
no,
access
you're right.
them
You're right.
through our own understanding. We can say these ideas in our own way or with our own words.
Yes. Yep.
And he says this beautiful thing about getting rid of treasure, because you're inhabiting the space that creates the treasure, so you don't really need the treasure anymore. It's like
Yeah.
something like that. It's really, really interesting, and it's so progressive. It's so, like, I feel like Emerson would be so, like you said earlier, it would be so excited by the time. And as you said, the internet is kind of starting to be institutionalized in certain ways, and there's things coming down on it that are not making it as democratic as it was. But even just the exploration of of the sciences, of all of this sort of exploration that's going on right now, I think he'd be completely enamored by.
Yeah, I think especially the younger Emerson, but even the older, I think just he's super interested in the new technologies of the time, whether that's the development of photography or the trains or whatever, right? I mean, these were things that were kind of changing the world fundamentally, and the part that I think would be most interesting, at least from my perspective, if I'm thinking about Emersonian idealism and how it might align with some of this stuff, is the way that any sort of interaction now can become global in an instant, right? And the way that then forces us to reconceive of our ideas. And of course, we don't all. Some of us dig in, right? And it's a natural instinct, and it's a necessary instinct in some ways to maintain certain cultural preferences or priorities, right? But the way that becomes a barrier against exploration would horrify Emerson, right? That the whole point of this is that of Emerson's really radical democratic vision is that, look, if we get everyone participating, no one's going to have the answer, right? But once we got all the voices out, we can see the range of things, right? And from that, we're going to be able to discern something close to the truth of the matter, right? But we gotta get all those people to the table. If we don't, we can't actually hear those things. We can't see their perspective without actually hearing them and seeing them and listening to them, right? And that seems to me really strikingly powerful in current technology, right? And it's also why technology is scary and dangerous to so many people also, right? Because it does threaten our institutions. There's no way around that. I mean, the internet has fundamentally threatened not just kind of dictatorships who shut them down, but it threatens the grounding of American government systems and traditions, because we're having to confront these ways of seeing the world that are so drastically different than our own, right? And Emerson found in that liveliness and energy and power, right? Not the need to resist and draw boundaries, right? I'm hedging a little bit there now that I'm saying that. I may reconceive that a little bit, but the gist of it, I think, is accurate. I may have just overstated a bit.
Okay. I want to get into Emerson's rhetoric. I want to get a little bit more into his ideas on language. You say something really, really interesting to me in your book. You say that the education system has sort of been hijacked by those who, and I'm going to quote here, those who would have us believe that language is nothing more than a standardized system of signs to be mastered or a set of lessons to be memorized and mimicked.
Yeah.
If it is not a system of symbols, you know, I'm playing devil's advocate here,
No, right.
but what is it? What is language?
Yeah, so I want to emphasize that part about that it's solely that's something to be mastered, right?
Of course it is, but
yeah. And so it is a system of symbols that are representing our perspectives. But the key thing there is that using that system as a way to reify or stabilize the inherent instability of what we know and how we know it is folly, right? Emerson's own rhetoric, the way he constructed his lectures, was explicitly and deliberately opposed to the genre of public speaking that was standard at the time. That starts with the homiletics, which if you read his early sermons or any of them, you'll see a fairly standard homiletic form that you see as it goes along. He starts pushing on the boundaries on. You can see Wes Mott is a scholar, WPI, who's really smart on this stuff. And that ultimately leads to his break from the church. And from my perspective, his break from the church is not simply around ideas. His claim, or what he states, is around the Eucharist. But it's also about the accessibility to the language that allows us to approach the divine, right? So who has control of that? And it's not enough to say kind of in the old church mode, right, where in the Catholic Church, where priest is mediator, right, and the Protestant individual relationship type of notion that's become so big now in American theology in particular. Well, not theology, I'd say American evangelicalism in particular, where kind of the individual connection to the divine is kind of writ large as everything. Those two separate things still rely on a language and a form and way of speaking that is controlled, right? And whether deliberately or not, it's kind of beside the point. They are wrapped up in the same things. I could cut out all pictures and visuals of it. I could turn on an evangelical preacher, change the voice, name, and everything. Just by the cadence and the structure of the claims they're making, you would know instantaneously that's an evangelical Christian, right? Making the claim. And the reason is because there's a formula, right, that we plug into and that we have for a long time. And Emerson grew really distressed by this because it reflected formulaic thinking for him. And so you see in his lectures, as he breaks out of the church and leaves the church himself, you see his lectures increasingly attempts of leaving behind lecture formats. And what distresses him most about the lecture hall later on, from that early hope that it'll be the new church where new ideas are generated, what distresses him most are all those rules and regulations governing not just what you can talk about, but how you can talk about it. So all these years of reading Emerson's written essays as this kind of revolutionary poetic way of expressing oneself is actually a deliberate attempt to undo lecture propriety. That's what he's messing with audience expectations there, and he's doing it on purpose, right? And there's plenty of evidence for that in his journals and even in his own lectures, where he's setting up structures of how one expresses oneself around short ideas that then are illuminated in some larger fashion, but that are meant to prompt the listener to come to their own idea. It's not that he wants it to be absorbed as a truth itself. He wants it to kind of rattle the soul of the audience to see what comes out of their mouth, right? So that he has several images that are really great of an effective speaker talking, and then the audience members being unable to contain themselves and having to say something. Or if in earlier essay, if the the preacher is too dull or whatever, which is pretty much all preachers as far as Emerson's concerned. You go outside into the winter air to experience life in reality, right? Yeah. And what he's suggesting here is that it's not just the formal structures, it's the way we talk about them that inform and that fundamentally change our ability to access new ideas and new ways of thinking and new ways of being with each other, right? And that's at the core of it for him.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. I didn't really know that he started as a preacher. Is that?
That's correct.
So he sort of
Boston, Unitarian.
Okay. And you see, I mean, I had a question about how he maybe would have seen himself, or, you know, I read something, it was some paper about him where somebody described him more as a prophet than a philosopher. Yeah. And I can see, like you say, have said in his earlier writing, like, I think I read Ethics, and it just comes off very like there's this spirit, like he has the Holy Spirit in him, right? Like he's just going, he's rapping, right? Yeah. And it's how much of language for him is accessing this sort of spirit versus articulating using reason, something like that.
It's a great question. Okay, so yeah, that's a complicated one, but it's I mean, I've got quick, easy answers, but then they reduce kind of what I think he's up to, right? And on the one hand, you know, there's times in which he laments explicitly kind of people's over rationalization, right? He's tired of the forms of argument and says that explicitly, like the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, right. You know, Hegelian stuff, or setting up a speech in such a way that you're leading an audience to a certain conclusion in some sort of way, right? And so that frustrates him because, again, he sees it as, well, I would argue that he sees it as disrespectful for the audience member, right? And from his perspective, the best thing you can do is agitate the soul of the audience member so that their soul is unable to contain itself and must speak its own reality, whatever that is, which is shared in some capacity. That's what's key. It's not a completely random outside. I mean, the fact that I can speak to you and agitate it suggests that there's a connection. It doesn't mean that it's completely separate, right? We're still bound in somehow or connected in some sort of way, right? So it's not a free-for-all in that way. But it requires, in some sort of way, my willingness to set aside my desire to move you step by step towards the conclusion, right? And the reason Emerson wants to do that is he doesn't want the speaker to feel like they don't have things to learn themselves, right? That in that it is an exchange ultimately. So yes, there's wisdom. Yes, there are lessons to be learned from sages. Yes, there's people. But it's worth noticing that Emerson says explicitly, we recognize in those great texts previously our own rejected thoughts. In other words, if left alone or shaken to the core and stuff, we'll come to similar conclusions. We don't need to be led to that in some sort of methodical way, right? That instead we need to be inspired. We need to be grown, because he has great faith that whatever comes from you at that point will ultimately align with some sort of greater sense of connection with others, right? He doesn't believe that the person who is activated in that way will ultimately do wrong, right? He really does believe that they'll do right, even if some of the other people around them doesn't recognize it as a right, as something that's meaningful. I think that.
So is it like? So it comes off as like very intuitive, like there's this intuition that we must follow. That any sort of rigid, like you said, methodical guide is almost the enemy or the antithesis of the human spirit. That
I think that's fair to say. I think that's fair to say, and part of why he extend that a little further. Part of why he was so enamored with being an American, right, is that he saw this as a fertile new ground where such traditions didn't hold sway hard enough yet, right? We didn't have a millennia of traditions built into our culture yet. We were creating them, right? And that for him, we wanted to be constantly in that state of creation, right? Because that's how you approach, that's how you somehow get yourself on eye level with understanding something greater than us, right? Is to be in that process constantly, right? You know, and that's one of the problems, to kind of circle back to an earlier question. That's part of the problems with kind of the reading Self-Reliance or in any other of his essays as advice, right? It fundamentally misses the project, right? It's in fact, you can find journal entries where he's just irate as hell that people are reading his, that are coming to his lectures, and then the newspapers would write summaries of the lectures, and it would say that he gave you advice on how to, you know, keep your money in certain banks or something, right? And
No way.
you know, and he'd be like, no, I'm not trying to give you, I'm trying to inspire you. I'm trying to get that part of you in yourself that's fallen asleep, that is working day by day under these cultural constraints that sometimes are productive, other times not, to really think about those things and do something about it. Right.
It's so, this is a very interesting area that we're kind of walking in right now. When I read him, and I guess it's because he has this sort of, I've seen the word middling, like this sort of very approachable philosophy.
Yep.
It reminds me again of like our culture today with the self-help. Mm-hmm. And I guess I'm totally missing like what he's driving. I mean, I do see what you're saying when he does say things like, you don't, you know, stop paraphrasing person X from the past, this great like Caesar or Milton or whoever. But at the same time, it is hard not to engage with it on a personal development level.
Yes, right.
It is hard not to. And it's interesting because I'm interested in, it's a dilemma, right? Like he's trying to express these ideas, but I guess he's not wanting it to be taken like, oh, I'm gonna apply this Emersonian philosophy to my life and run with it. That is missing the point again, I guess.
Well, it's I'd go a little more nuanced there. If we use like Milton as example, mm-hmm. He wants you to read Milton and be inspired by Milton. Okay. And he even wants you to maybe even use some of that text as a way to filter ideas, right? Say, oh, but he doesn't want you to become the next Milton or to strive to be the next Milton. He wants you to use Milton to become the best, you know, Thompson. Right?
And that's so like I would go to Barnes and Noble and see that in the self-help section.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Right. Yeah.
You know? Like, and that's so cool because he's, you know, the beginning of this American voice, and we're seeing this kind of full circle. Yeah. And I relate to that a lot because even growing up, you know, you're constantly looking for sort of these vectors to like latch onto and try on. Right? Yeah. And you get to a certain point, if you're fortunate, and you may have to get to this point repeatedly in your life, where you realize, oh, like I am my own person, right? Like it's very Emersonian, this idea that only I can be I, right? Like only I can access the original, authentic, you know, purpose that is me, something like that. It's really interesting, and it just kind of speaks to all of sort of these things going on today with the self-help movements. I did have something that I wanted to follow up, but I'm totally forgetting.
Well, that's all right. I would even extend that even a little bit further and say, not only is it the way that you access that for yourself, right? Mm-hmm. But for Emerson, you have an obligation to do that also, right? Because it's only when you dare utter those things that we as other community members around you gain access not just to you, mm-hmm. but to that expression of divinity that is you, right? And so if you are withholding that or are caught within a system that doesn't allow you to do that, we're the loss, we lose from that also, right? That's not, we lose contact with not just you, but your pathway to that kind of transcendent connection, right? And that to me is super powerful, right? It requires us then to see our job as self-awareness. And I don't mean that just ripping across the veil, but also becoming, like trying to figure out who we are in certain moments at certain times, understanding that might shift. But it's an obligation for us, not just for ourselves, but for people around us. They deserve that, because then we're illuminating part of their pathway too, right? It's beautifully interwoven.
It is beautiful.
For me, what's
part
great.
of through the courage, or through the through being yourself, you're allowing others to sort of, be. It's so hard to.
No, that's right. No, it's as though you have a better sense. So if these folks around me are all working, well, I'll go this way. If these folks around me are all working in similar fashion towards understanding themselves and their relationship to divinity and the world around them,
right?
And I've got better anchors for understanding where I might go also, right? And I might have a better sense then of the possibilities of pathways that are available to me, right? And that's only enriching, right? That does not, well, I shouldn't say only enriching. Yes, some of those pathways may be of the devil, right? But we need to know they're there. We've got to be able to see them and name them. And the only way that happens is if people make those steps, right? It's a complicated issue, right? But it's also, to my mind, a very hopeful one.
Let's see here. I got so many. Okay, I do want to bring this up. Again, with the practical, you said that he wasn't really interested in this practical, like what to do with your money, sort of thing.
Yep.
There's a big interest right now in Stoicism, particularly for its applicability to everyday life. It's I don't know if there's a question. I guess it's just this sort of statement that we've sort of practicalized philosophy, which is something these inquisitive intellectual curiosity, we're looking for a practical manifestation of that, which there are some great quotes that do push this idea that philosophy should be practical, that it should lead to a better life. Yes. And I think obviously Emerson is doing that. It's not sort of self-serving, intellectual curiosity for the sake of it. How do you, I guess for just everyday life, like what are there core tenets in either Emerson or Transcendentalism that you think are very applicable for people today?
So I would draw a distinction at the outset. One, it's not that he didn't want things that would be practical. I mean, there is a very, and he himself was, didn't take much reading in his journals till you see that he was definitely concerned about the practical day-to-day realities of living, right? Was he getting paid for that lecture, et cetera, right? I mean, who's where's the fire water bucket go,
right.
So there's that. And there is, the point of some of his pithy sayings is to prompt people into thinking for themselves. But even that can be seen as practical in a certain domain. And so, but it really is more, I would say, even with Stoicism, and I'm no expert in Stoicism, and it's interesting, there's been a nice kind of Stoic turn to some degree in rhetoric. Also, a good friend of mine, Lois Agnew's written a nice book on that some years back. And Emerson was enamored of the Stoics, certainly. I mean, he besides Zena and Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, regularly, right, praises them, not just cites them, so praises them. So there is something there, but part of that is the Stoics' kind of love of virtue for virtue's sake. I mean, which is practical in as far as it goes, but also completely unpractical, right? I mean,
right.
It's practical in the sense of it's asking you to live life in a certain way, right? Which is to seek virtue, right? But it's not practical in the sense of virtue for virtue's sake. It's hardly a practical endeavor, right? This is so I think you're right that there's a tension there, and I think I don't know exactly how I'd understand it, except to say that Emerson was concerned about how we act in the world. He was absolutely concerned about that. He didn't just want, the ivory tower academic or the person in the background who's philosophizing. And that's how he was made fun of for that, though, right? Like Hawthorne has his lovely short story, Celestial Railroad, which takes the trope of Pilgrim's Progress, and at one point, this guy is going through his progress on his pilgrimage, and he passes a giant cave, and inside of it is this amorphous, vaporous creature of ether that rambles on in meaningless terms and stuff, and it's the giant transcendentalist who's hanging out in there, right? And so, I mean, so this is certainly something he's made fun of for.
Yeah.
But he does care a lot, especially in his later writing. He cares a lot. How do we live? I mean, what do we do? How do we function in this world? And I guess my answer would be that I think his response is ultimately kind of back to the same, which is like, look, get inspired to pursue something, right? And do it, right? That's and trust that the truth will out on the tail end of that. I don't know if that helps fully answer the Stoic connection, but maybe.
No, I think it does. I definitely think it does. I have this one question here, more about sort of rhetoric and language. So, I know you're really interested in, obviously your concentration is rhetoric. And I remember you telling me once that, you started as being interested in philosophy, and you realized that rhetoric was a way to look at these questions in a different sort of way.
Yes.
That Emerson, in the introduction of your book, you bring up that Emerson's been looked at as a writer, as a thinker, but his rhetoric, his career as a lecturer,
yeah.
Hasn't really been looked at to the same in the same degree.
Yeah.
So there's this sort of difference between the written word and expressing ideas through the written word and through language, like through speech and speaking and delivering ideas via voice. I heard an idea recently about how the spoken word has been with us much longer than the written word, that it's more human in a way. Are you familiar with this new social media app called Clubhouse? Have you heard?
No.
So basically, it's this new thing going on where it's essentially chat rooms, live chat rooms, but it's all audio based. So it's essentially like you're on the phone with, maybe there's 10 speakers, and it's like a conference in a way. And then there's listeners, and you can call a listener up to ask a question. It's actually really, really cool. My question to you is, as a main source of communication, as the internet is progressing, as our means of communication are constantly changing, Twitter is obviously massively popular, and that's based in the written word. Do you think one will win out over the other? Or obviously it's not a zero-sum game here.
Yeah.
But
wow.
Something along those lines.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So, there's a scholar some time ago, Walter Ong, who talks about this transition between oral culture and literary culture and what it might have done, not just to the culture, but to our brain and how we function and how we think, and how then cultures adjust accordingly. And I'm one of those people who's fully on board that thinks the internet revolution is doing the same thing, right? And so, there's something in oral communication, especially exchanges of communication, that's so fundamentally different than written communication, right? And and that, interestingly enough, I think we probably need to go back to Plato and take a little more seriously his complaint about the emergence of writing. You know, he in the Phaedrus, he talks about this new technology that's going to ruin everything, right? Which is this writing, right? And the reason it's going to ruin everything is because it kills memory, right? Because you don't need memory if you don't need to flex memory if things are held in text for you, right? And you know, this his prediction didn't exactly bear out as true, right? But having said that, he's right in the sense that it's changed everything, and fundamentally changed. And we're seeing the same thing now. I mean, if we circle back even to what we said earlier, what's it mean that you're held to account for things you said out loud in whatever context that it might have been? And the reason you're held to account is because it becomes seen as something stable, right? And the oral world is never was stable. Right? It changes constantly, as our thinking does. Lots of studies have shown this over and over again. And it's because what it creates is something in between the people, right? The reality of whatever is being spoken is between you and me. It's not in me. It's not in you. It's somewhere in that space and that exchange. And you know, places like, in a sense, like the Clubhouse is going to complicate that, right? Because on the one hand, you've got people who I guess are vested with speaking in it, and people who aren't, right? And yet, my guess is is it recorded? Is it made part?
So
of
you're not supposed to record it without permission, but obviously there's no
way to stop that.
Yeah, there's no way to stop it. So people record.
Yeah.
A conversation.
So then you're in those moments where, you know, in oral exchange, you may be sorting through something or caught with an emotional surprise or, you know, whatever. But then it can become stabilized by this technology, right? In the exact same way. And you see it in scholarship. You can see people who are writing articles now will cite things, not just in Twitter and that sort of thing, but will also cite, you know, audio recordings of someone who said X, right? And that suggests something about its permanence now that's just completely different. And I don't know what to make of it. I don't even know how to theorize or get my brain around what that might do in terms of how we think about our own epistemologies, like, and how we come to knowledge and how we come to wisdom, and how we sort our relationships and our ways of being in and around other people. I don't know, but it's not simple, and it's not, and I suspect how we're seeing it now can only be seen in light of this kind of literate culture that assumes stability in a way that oral communication never assumed, right? So something's changed. I don't know, especially something like that. And I'm thinking now of lectures that the faculty might give, or conferences with students someone might have, and then the student recording it, and the student saying, "Hey, but you said this," and
right.
You're trying to explain the context, and it's not straightforward, especially when many eyes can look at it.
Right. It's very complicated. It's yeah, it's interesting because, you know, there is this romanticism around, you know, oral traditions, and even the fact that, you know, the Iliad wasn't really written down initially, right? It was like passed down orally. I tried to, a few years ago, I tried to remember a poem, right? I was like, oh, I want to recite this poem before dinner every time, right? I did it for like a few weeks and then I stopped. But it was a Khalil Gibran poem. Actually, it wasn't a poem. It was a part of The Prophet, right? A section on eating. So I memorized it. It took me a little while and I memorized it, and it felt so good to be able to like recall this poem. But anything longer than that, like I only memorized like half of it. I didn't even remember the whole passage there. But it's interesting because even like, you know, I can mumble my way through a Hail Mary or like our Father, but I don't know half the words I'm saying. It's sort of you lament, in a way, you kind of lament this lost ability, but who knows how much it's lost, because we're sort of so adaptable that like, you know, maybe we get it back, you know, still access it.
Certainly conceivable. You know, Walter Ong was of the mindset, you know, once you have literacy, you lose, oral culture is gone forever, right? That there's no ability to get your brain in the same spot as a solely oral culture, right? That the literate brain is so fundamentally different than the oral brain that you can't get there. And I suspect that there's going to be similar things about the digital brain. I
Twitter
think
brain.
yeah, it's not, and then you add AI to it, and God knows what we're going to get, right? But
Yeah.
you know, there are really basic ways in which I think even my son, who's 14, you know, the way he processes information in on some very basic things are the way I've described it to some other people. It's not linear in the same way. It's just not, right? So even our culture, my culture growing up, was linear, even in the sense of like how we spent our day watching television, right? We knew what time things were, and what when it began, when it ended. That's gone. That's, in fact, that seems outrageous to people like my son, right? Like, and they don't not just understand it, they like really don't understand it. Like they can't conceive it. Hold on, when that was what? Like you had like this, and then so you couldn't watch it then? Like I don't know. Like, what was that? And so if that, you know, with those things kind of giving way, and the temporality changes, our sense of ourself in relation to time changes. And with that, it's got to change our sense of relation, certainly in relation to space and other people. I mean, these are massively different and seismic shifts in our ways of understanding the world around us. And I don't know if we'll be able to go back to a more neat oral or even neater, this classic literate mind. I don't know if that's possible. I mean, I've probably changed in ways I don't even understand at this point. So. Yeah. I find it invigorating, but I still have that, there's that conservative side of me that laments what's being lost. And I try not to dwell there, because I think it's so much raging against the machine.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and I do think the possibilities are so great forward rise, right? There's, you know, my dissertation advisor used to emphasize that Emerson's key point is progress, progress, progress. Progress is, I think it's right, but the progress that Emerson's talking about is a kind of linear progress. And that doesn't really, that works in certain industries, but I don't think it defines the human condition right now. There's this kind of swirling around right now. It's not a step-by-step growth. It's this kind of, I don't know how to describe it. It's this kind of pulsing thing, right? Going out and then coming back in, and then, but when it comes back in, its center point is somewhere else, right? So it's like expands, and then the center's here, and then expands this way, and the center's here, right? And I don't know
what does that due to? Is that due to information availability, or is there?
I think the information availability, different types of voices being heard finally, right? I mean, there's no way we can ignore. I mean, it's hard for me to imagine things like the recent social justice movement outside the context of the digital era, right? I mean, I don't know that it accelerates in the way that it did without that, right? So many voices now are able to be heard, and we're trying to reconcile them, and lots of them are uncomfortable for me, even as I find some of them really interesting and invigorating myself. Some of those are the ones that make me most uncomfortable, because I realize how much I haven't seen the world in those lenses before, right?
Wow.
They feel threatening, even though most of them aren't. They simply are showing me something new, and just like, holy crap, what is that? So
yeah, there's constantly new information and new modes of existing that are being presented to you, and you kind of can't like ground. It's harder to ground yourself in like, this is this, and this is, you know, there is, I mean, there are still traditions, but nothing is monolithic anymore, right? Like nothing is the one culture, which is beautiful, but it obviously poses a new landscape for us to
and a wrought one. I mean, this is how can you define a nation or a culture if it's not shared around a certain cultural narrative? And I don't know that there's an answer yet, right? I don't know if there needs to be. I don't know what it is. You know, and you know, that's what prompts so much fear on the right side of the political spectrum, is some of that ground giving way, right? And it's inevitable at this point, and short of a major crackdown in mandates. But I think cat's out of the bag. I just don't think there's a way, and it's going to keep. I don't see how it doesn't challenge us forever going forward. I mean, we're the stable ground, which was actually, and this is a point that kind of key, that stable ground probably never was really stable. We just convinced ourselves it was, right? Because we only listened to the other people who kept telling us it was stable, right? Because
it was sort of a platform. A platform built on unstable ground or something like that.
Yeah, that's probably a good way of saying that. And I like the word platform there because it harkens to political dialogue also.
Oh, that too, yeah. I mean, so it's just curious, to just kind of wrap things up and bring it back to Emerson. I wonder, if it is this, if his mentality is this progress, how he would be like viewing the landscape, how he would be viewing this nonlinear progress. This kind of, we're seeing a lot of traditions are dead or dying, right? And I think that we're having as a culture, our spiritual connection to these things they're non-existent, right? And we don't necessarily have replacements.
No, that's right. That's a great point. And I think part of what Emerson would have loved is that we're being unshackled from things that have kind of contained us, right? And I think that's exciting. And I think some of the things that we had shackled ourselves to were phantoms in the first place, right? And so I think leaving those behind would be a very, would please an Emersonian mind greatly, right? I don't know though about, how he might respond to this kind of complete uncertainty around some of that stuff, right? And, I suspect he would ultimately want to lean into it because the flip side of that is kind of the rise of certain types of thinking that are more dogmatic, right? And that are more certain and more stable, honestly, right? And he's going to, we have Emerson's entire career to see him pushing back against that sort of stuff constantly, right? I mean, he is from the beginning to the end trying to say, look, we don't know these things accurately. We can't say that, and we can't make other people believe that. They've got to figure it out, right? And now that we have, it's interesting. I don't know if we should talk this kind of insertion of all sorts of different viewpoints as illuminating or destabilizing or illuminating in its mode of destabilization. I mean, Emerson valued consistency to a degree, despite what he says, and he didn't want everything off the rails. But on the flip side, this is a guy who, understood that John Brown may have had a point. So I think this would be an invigorating time for a mind like Emerson's, for sure.
Professor Thompson, thank you so much for doing this.
Absolutely.
I really appreciate it. I'd love to have you back on for round 2.
A lot of fun. I really appreciate it, and look forward to seeing you do more of these things.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Great. See you.